Parents, ashamed of the disgrace, threw their pregnant daughter out onto the street. After 15 years, they decided to visit her and their grandson. But before we continue, please write in the comments which city you are watching this video from. Enjoy. Keisha stood by the window of her small room, looking at the snow-covered courtyard. She was 16 and the world seemed vast, full of opportunities. She was in the 10th grade, and her heart would race whenever she thought of Igor, a tall boy with brown eyes who once offered to carry her backpack home. Their relationship began quietly, almost imperceptibly. At first, there were chance meetings after classes, then long walks in the park where they talked about everything under the sun. Igor was a dreamer, but his dreams were practical. He wanted to go to university, build a career, and leave their small town. Keisha envisioned the future in bright colors, a cozy home, children, laughter around the dinner table. But everything changed. Igor started calling less frequently, his responses became shorter, and their after-school meetings vanished. One day, he came to her house and, looking at the floor, said, "Keisha, I can't do this. You're a good person, but I need to focus on myself, on my plans. I'm moving to the city alone. I don't love you anymore." He left, and she was alone with a void she couldn't explain. A few weeks later, Keisha realized something was wrong. Morning bouts of nausea, fatigue, a strange feeling in her body. A test bought from the pharmacy confirmed her worst fears: she was pregnant. Her world crumbled, and she was terrified. But deep down, there was a glimmer of hope. She would tell her parents, and they would help her. They had always been her support. Keisha waited until evening when her father returned from work and her mother finished preparing dinner. They sat at the table, her father, Mikhail Petrovich, a taciturn man with a stern face, and her mother, Elena Ivanovna, a meticulous woman with pursed lips. Keisha, clenching her fists, said, "Mom, Dad, I have something to tell you. I'm pregnant." The silence that followed was deafening. The spoon in Elena Ivanovna's hand froze over the plate, and Mikhail Petrovich slowly raised his eyes, his gaze heavy as stone. "What did you say?" he asked, as if he couldn't believe his ears. "I'm pregnant," Keisha repeated, her voice trembling. "I don't know what to do, but I want you to help me." Elena Ivanovna abruptly stood up, her chair screeching backward. Her face turned red and her eyes narrowed. "Do you realize what you've done?" she screamed. "You've disgraced us. Everyone will talk about how our daughter—" Keisha flinched as if struck. She had expected anger, but not like this. "Mom, I didn't mean to," she began, but her father interrupted her. "Silence!" he roared, slamming his fist on the table so hard that the dishes rattled. "Do you understand what this means for you? Neighbors, colleagues, everyone will point fingers." Keisha shrank back, tears streaming down her cheeks as she looked at her parents, searching for a glimmer of sympathy but seeing only fury and shame. "I can't fix this," she whispered. "But I'm your daughter." "You are no longer our daughter," Elena Ivanovna declared. "We can't live with this disgrace." Elena Ivanovna left the kitchen and returned with a bag old, worn out, the one Keisha used to take to school. "Pack your things," she said coldly. "You're leaving right now." "Mom, where will I go?" Keisha's voice broke into sobs. "It's winter outside. Where will I go?" "That's your problem," her mother retorted. "You ruined everything, and we won't tolerate this in our home." Keisha fell to her knees. "Please, don't throw me out. I'm scared. I can't handle this alone," she cried, tears streaming down her face. But Elena Ivanovna pushed her away. "Leave," she repeated, her voice hissing. "And don't you dare come back." Mikhail Petrovich finally stood up. He grabbed Keisha by the arm and dragged her to the door. She struggled, clinging to the door frame, but her father was stronger. "Dad, please don't," she begged. "I love you. I didn't mean for this to happen." He didn't respond and pushed her out onto the porch. The snow swirled around her as she fell to her knees, the bag slipping from her grasp. The door slammed shut with a dull thud, and the lock clicked. She was alone in the darkness in the freezing night, with a child inside her. Kasia screamed, pounding her fists on the door. "Mom, Dad, let me in." But there was no answer, only silence and the howling wind. She sat on the porch until her fingers went numb from the cold. Inside her, a storm raged: pain, fear, despair. The parents she loved and trusted had rejected her so cruelly that she couldn't breathe. They hadn't just thrown her out, they had erased her from their lives as if she were a mistake, a stain on their reputation. Kasia didn't know how long she sat on the porch. Her feet were frozen, her tears had dried, leaving salty trails on her cheeks. She picked up her bag and wandered down the street, not knowing where to go. The only person who came to mind was her grandmother, Margarita Semenovna, an elderly woman living on the outskirts of town in a small house with a crooked fence. When Kasia knocked on Margarita Semenovna's door, the night had already enveloped the small town. It was past midnight, and the frost bit deeply, numbing her fingertips. She knocked weakly, barely holding herself up. Her body trembled not only from the cold but also from the terror of being rejected again. The door creaked open, and Margarita Semenovna appeared in the doorway, wrapped in an old, faded robe, holding a flashlight. "Kasia, what's wrong?" Her voice trembled, and her eyes widened in horror. "You're frozen solid. Dear Lord, what happened?" Kasia couldn't answer. She collapsed like a drowning person clutching at a straw. Sobs racked her body with such force that it seemed they would tear her chest apart. Tears that she had held back the entire way now flowed uncontrollably, mixing with the wet snow on her cheeks. She couldn't speak, couldn't even breathe. She could only cry, burying her face in her grandmother's shoulder. Margarita Semenovna, struggling to support her, pulled her inside. Margarita Semenovna slammed the door shut, shielding them from the icy wind, and almost forcefully sat Kasia by the old stove that crackled in the corner of the room. Her hands trembled as she rubbed Kasia's frozen fingers, trying to restore warmth to her body. "Breathe, my dear, breathe," she whispered. Her voice was gentle, but there was worry in it. "What did they do to you?" Kasia didn't answer. She sat huddled by the stove, her teeth chattering. And the events of that horrible evening played over and over in her mind. Only after an hour, when her grandmother placed a mug of hot tea with honey in front of her, did Kasia manage to utter her first words. Her voice was hoarse and broken, as if she had been screaming for hours. "They threw me out," she whispered, and tears welled up in her eyes again. "They said I'm no longer their daughter." Margarita Semenovna froze, her hand holding the mug suspended in mid-air, and her wrinkled face grew even sterner. She listened silently as Kasia choked out her story. "They couldn't have done this," Margarita Semenovna whispered when Kasia finished. Her voice trembled with anger, but there was also a deep sorrow in it. She knelt before Kasia and embraced her tightly, enveloping her in the warmth of her old but strong body. It was the first warmth Kasia had felt in hours. The first comfort after her world had crumbled. "You're home now," Margarita Semenovna said firmly, stroking her hair. "No one will abandon you here. We'll get through this together, Kasia." The days after that night dragged on slowly. Kasia would wake up in the small room of her grandmother's house, which smelled of old wood and dried herbs, and each time she would be overwhelmed by a wave of terror. She lay there staring at the cracked ceiling, asking herself how to go on. Her heart ached, but even more tormenting was the fear for the child she carried. Margarita became her anchor in the chaos. She didn't judge, didn't ask unnecessary questions, and didn't look at her with reproach. Every morning, she prepared breakfast, simple porridge or an omelette, and sat beside Kasia, silently holding her hand. Sometimes, she told old stories about her youth, about how she survived the war and raised Kasia's mother. These stories were a lifeline. One evening, noticing Kasia avoiding her gaze, Margarita Semenovna approached her. She took Kasia's face in her wrinkled hands and made her look at her. "You're a strong girl," she said softly but with such conviction that Kasia almost believed her. "You're carrying life. It's not a disgrace, it's a miracle." and your baby will be strong like you." But the pain was too deep. Those closest to her had betrayed her, and that one bled every day. Yet, in Margarita Semenovna's eyes, there was an unshakable faith, and Katya clung to it like a last hope. Kasia gave birth to a son in a small district hospital that smelled of chlorine and old sheets. The labor was long and agonizing. She gripped the nurse's hand, feeling like she couldn't endure it, that it was the end. But then a weak cry rang out, and everything changed. They placed the baby on her chest, tiny, wrinkled, his little body trembling with his first breath. Kasia looked at him, and tears streamed down her face, not from pain but from a new, unfamiliar feeling. She named him Slavik, after the grandfather she barely remembered. When Margarita Semenovna came to the hospital, she stood by the bed for a long time, looking at her granddaughter and great-grandson. Her eyes glistened with tears, but her lips smiled. "Look how beautiful he is," she whispered. "You did it, Kasia. You gave him life." Kasia nodded, pressing Slavik to her chest. For the first time in months, she felt something akin to hope. Even so, the shadow of the past did not let go of her. She looked at her son and thought, "I must be strong for him." However, every night, when the house fell silent, she saw that day her mother's screams, her father's cold stare, the slam of the door that cut her off from her family. Slavik grew quickly, filling the small house with joy. His big eyes, reflecting the whole world, followed butterflies outside the window, his grandmother's bustling, and Kasia as she learned to be a mother. He was curious, always reaching for something new, a spoon, an old book, a sunbeam on the floor. Kasia looked at him, and her heart swelled with love, but that love was always mixed with pain. She tried to be strong. In the morning, she would get up, prepare food, help her grandmother with the chores, and in the evening, she would put Slavik to bed, singing lullabies she barely remembered. But at night, when silence enveloped the house, she heard her mother's voice screaming, "Get out!" Her father's hand pushing her into the cold, the sound of the door slamming shut. She asked herself, how could they? Why was their shame stronger than their love? Margaret saw her pain. Sometimes she would sit beside her, take her hand, and stay like that until Kasia fell asleep from exhaustion. Her grandmother didn't say much, but her presence was a beacon in the darkness. She taught Kasia to live again, not for herself, but for Slavik. One day, when Slavik was 3, he climbed onto Kasia's lap and asked, "Mom, where's my other grandmother?" Kasia froze, her throat tightened, and she didn't know what to say. Margarita Semenovna, overhearing, approached and gently said, "She's far away, my dear. But I'm here, and your mom is here. We're your family." Slavik smiled and ran off to play, and Kasia looked at her grandmother with gratitude. But that evening, she stood by the window for a long time, gazing into the darkness, thinking about how her son would never know those who should have loved him. Years passed. Slavik started school, and Katia noticed how much he loved to draw. His pencil sketches filled the house, trees, birds' faces. He was a dreamer like she once was. When he turned 15, he began to think about his future. "Mom, I want to study art," he said one day. "But maybe it's better to go to college. It's more reliable." Katia smiled, suppressing a lump in her throat. "Do what you love, Slavik. I believe in you." One day, Kasia met Andrei, the owner of a cafe in the town center. He came to their house to buy pies that Margarita Semenovna baked for sale. Seeing Slavik's drawings on the walls, he paused. "Did your son draw these?" he asked. Katia nodded. Andrei smiled. "He's got talent. I want to hang his work in my cafe." Slavik was overjoyed. His artwork adorned the cafe walls, and customers praised it. Kasia looked at her son with pride, but deep down, the shadow of the past lingered. 15 years after that fateful winter night when her life was shattered, Kasia stood by the stove, stirring soap. Slavik, now a tall teenager with thoughtful eyes, was sketching something at the table, and her grandmother dozed in a chair by the stove, wrapped in an old blanket. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Kasia turned off the gas, wiped her hands on her apron, and went to answer it. Her heart pounded with a vague unease. She turned the key, and the hinges creaked as the door opened to reveal them Michael and Alina, the parents she hadn't seen in 15 years. Those who had erased her from their lives with such cruelty that she still woke up from the nightmare. Their once thick hair had thinned and grayed, their shoulders stooped under the weight of the years, and their faces were etched with deep wrinkles like cracked earth. Elena Ivanovna looked even more haggard. Her back was bent as if under the burden of guilt, and her eyes, once full of condemnation, now seemed dull and lost. They stood on the threshold, shifting uncomfortably from foot to foot, saying nothing. Finally, Elena raised her gaze and whispered almost inaudibly, "We wanted to see you, Kasia." Those words struck her like a blow. Kasia froze, her hand gripping the doorframe so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She looked at them, and a storm of emotion surged within her, not just anger, but a hurricane of pain, resentment, and memories she had tried to bury for years. She stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter, not out of pity or a desire to forgive, but because she wanted to hear what they had to say. She wanted to look into their eyes and understand if they realized what they had done to her. They entered cautiously, as if afraid to disturb the fragile silence of the house. Mikhail Petrovich removed his old cap, twisting it in his hands, while Elena Ivanovna adjusted her headscarf, avoiding her daughter's gaze. Kasia closed the door, and the sound of the latch clicking shut echoed like a gunshot in her ears. She turned to face them, crossing her arms to hide her trembling. At that moment, Slavik emerged from the room. His voice cut through the silence, sharp and cold as an autumn wind. "Is that you?" he asked. "Where were you when Mum needed help? When she was all alone?" Elena Ivanovna flinched and looked down at the floor, while Mikhail Petrovich coughed, his face flushing, but he said nothing. Their silence was louder than any words, and it ignited a new fire within Kasia. She remembered that night, the icy wind penetrating her thin jacket. Her cries at the locked door, her tears freezing on her cheeks. She remembered falling to her knees in the snow, begging them to let her back in, and the sound of the door slamming shut. She remembered the emptiness and despair that followed. Margarita, awakened by the voices, slowly rose from her chair. Her old bones creaked, but her gaze was sharp as a blade. She leaned forward, supporting herself on her cane, and her voice, hoarse with age but full of strength, shattered the silence. "You threw her out like she was nothing, pregnant and helpless, and you didn't even look back. And now you come here as if nothing happened. How dare you cross this threshold?" Her words hung heavy in the air. Elena Ivanovna bit her lip, her hands trembling, but she remained silent. Mikhail Petrovich opened his mouth as if to speak, but then closed it, looking down. Kasia stood motionless, her chest heaving with ragged breaths. She looked at them, these people who were once her world, and found not a drop of pity within her. They hadn't apologized, hadn't asked for forgiveness. They just stood there expecting her to take them back, as if 15 years of pain could be erased with one visit. "Say something," she finally demanded. "Why did you do this to me? Why did you choose your shame over me?" Elena Ivanovna raised her tear-filled eyes and whispered, "We didn't know how to handle it. We were afraid of what people would say." "People." Kasia stepped toward her, her face contorted with anger and pain. "And what about me? I was your daughter. I was on my knees begging you, and you slammed the door in my face. You left me to die in the cold with a baby inside me that I didn't even know how to raise." Mikhail Petrovich took a step forward, his voice low and trembling. "Kasia, we made a mistake. We didn't mean to." "You didn't make a mistake," she interrupted, her eyes flashing with tears. "You grabbed me by the arm and threw me out onto the street. And Mom screamed that I was no longer her daughter. You didn't make a mistake, you decided I was worthless." Tears streamed down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. She wanted them to see her pain, to feel even a fraction of what she had endured. Slavik approached her and took her hand. His face was tense, but there was support in his eyes. Margarita Semenovna struck her cane against the floor, her voice thundering, "Get out! You don't deserve to be here. You lost her that night, and no words can change that." The parents stood in silence. Ilona dropped her headscarf but didn't pick it up, and Mikhail clenched his cap so tightly that the fabric crumpled. They turned and left, their steps heavy and uncertain. The door closed behind them, and Kasia was left standing there, staring into the emptiness they had left behind. She went to the window and watched as the red taillights of their old car flickered in the darkness, slowly disappearing around the corner. Her heart beat unevenly, and there was a lump in her throat. For 15 years she had lived with this pain. And now that they had come, nothing had changed. They hadn't returned what she had lost, they hadn't healed her wound, they had only reopened it. "You and Slavik, they lost us, not the other way around," Margarita Semenovna said, approaching her. Kasia nodded, but tears still streamed down her face. She turned and embraced her grandmother, burying her face in her shoulder as she had done that first night. The pain was still there, raw and deep, but beside her stood the people who had never betrayed her. Slavik joined them, wrapping his arms around them both, and in that moment Kasia felt that she no longer feared the past. It could hurt her, but it couldn't break her. The day of Slavik's graduation was a bright spot in their lives. The morning began with a flurry of activity. Kasia ironed his new suit, Margarita baked a pie, and Slavik paced nervously around the room, rehearsing his speech. When he emerged in his dark blue jacket, holding his diploma, Katia paused, struck by how her son, her little boy, had grown into a strong, talented young man. She approached him, straightening his tie, and barely held back her tears. Her fingers trembled. But she smiled. "You're my pride and joy," she whispered, and he smiled back. That evening there was a reception at the school. The hall buzzed with the voices of parents, teachers, and graduates. Slavik received praise from the principal for his artwork and achievements, and Kasia and Margarita applauded louder than anyone. But at one point, standing by the window with a glass in her hand, Kasia felt a presence behind her. She turned and saw her father. Mikhail stood to the side, his coat rumpled and his eyes wary. He approached her and said softly, "Kasia, I'm sorry. We shouldn't have done what we did. I can't sleep at night thinking about it." She looked at him, and her heart ached, but it wasn't relief, it was emptiness. 15 years ago, she had begged him for forgiveness, and now he came to her with these words, but they meant nothing. "You're right," she replied coldly. "You shouldn't have. But you did, and I survived it without you." Margarita, standing nearby, added, "It's too late for regrets, Misha. We built a life without you. Go and live with your guilt." He nodded, looking down, and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Kasia watched him go but felt only weariness. The pain of her parents' betrayal would always be with her, like a scar that no longer bleeds but serves as a reminder. She turned to Slavik, who was laughing with his friends, and to Margarita, who looked at her with pride. This was her true family, unbreakable and steadfast. And in that strength, she found her solace.